welcome to this ET Now special. I'm Nayantara Rai. I have a very special guest with me. He's the top boss of HUL, but today he's talking to us as the newly president of FICCI. Mr. Mehta, thank you so much for giving us your time right here.
Thank you, Nayantara. Absolute pleasure to speak to you.
Welcome to New Delhi. I know it's cold and we're all discussing the winter that's there in the stock markets and hopefully not there for the economy, but I want to begin by asking you, you're taking over FICCI, such an important industry body, at a time when we thought the endemic was here, but maybe it's not the end of coronavirus and we have a lot of problems to maybe get through. But first, what would be your top priorities?
You know, my top priorities from the lens of FICCI President would, of course, be first is strengthening FICCI as an institution. This is an amazing institution. Not many people know its great history and legacy, which goes back to over 9 decades. And it has partnered the country in its growth journey. And every institution needs to be reinvented and reimagined. So one of the things would be is how do we strengthen the organization? It's an organization with great people, very passionate people, highly talented people. So one of the things would be how do we get the best out of them, make it into an even better, more resilient and wonderful place for everyone. From a priority perspective, FICCI has many sectorial leaders. There are many wonderful committees where we have great chairpersons and co-chairs. But I would be focusing on a few important areas. For instance, I would be focusing on climate and sustainability. I would be focusing on MSMEs. The other is R&D and innovations. Industry 4.0, the whole domain space of women's empowerment. So these are some of the areas where I will personally get involved into and seeing how do we raise the game and how do we contribute to our members, because they are our most important stakeholders, and also to the country at large with a thought leadership.
I'm going to personally focus on how you're going to manage time management between being HUL top boss and FICCI president, but that's a lesson that I would want to personally learn from you.
No, it's going to be a challenge, not an easy task. And what I'll have to be is even more disciplined than I've been in the past.
Gosh.
And I'll earmark certain days every month when I'll dedicate to FICCI. And that would mean coming down to Delhi, spending time with the team, and also during those 3 days being laser focused on where I should get involved in.
Hopefully media interviews too.
Certainly with you.
But Mr. Mehta, I did notice when you mentioned your priorities, and I want to get into them one at a time. But we're talking at a time when it's once again about inflation, a weakening rupee, excess liquidity. We've seen already in one action by the FOMC, we've seen Bank of England do an out-of-turn rate cut, all eyes on the Reserve Bank. But this is going to be something that industry needs to watch out for, and it's impacting all citizens.
Absolutely. Let's pause for a moment and look at a bigger picture. Is last year, same time, we did not have a vaccine in sight, and our economy was degrowing, was in the negative territory. And look here, a year down the road, we have vaccinated, we have provided 1.3 billion doses of vaccine. Over 50% of the eligible population has got vaccinated.
No, it's like a miracle. It actually
It's phenomenal. Look at the economy. Whatever GDP we lost last year, we would be recovering this year.
If we have a booster shot.
No, I'm coming to it. No, even if you look at the path, all consensus says that we should be in the vicinity of 9% for this year. And then even if you look at break up the peel the onion a bit and look at your numbers in a bit more detail, if you look at the tax collection, 30% increase in the first 7 months, not versus the previous year, but versus 2019. That's phenomenal. And it's both direct and indirect taxes, both have been growing upwards of 20%. Yeah. Then when you look at it, exports. Yeah, our exports were stagnating in the vicinity of $310 billion, merchandise exports. We are now talking about, you know, when the target of 400 billion was being talked about, I was worried that it is a very stretched target, whether India will attain it. Now we are on the path to attaining it. Look at the FDIs coming in, while most of it is, or a large part of it is in the tech space. So be it.
And, yeah.
But so be it. You are bringing in foreign money, you're bringing in technology with it in many times, and it augurs so well for the country. So there are so many good things happening in the country. And
oh, this is India's decade, as everyone says that, and you're taking over at a time when it's just starting.
Oh, absolutely. And I am, you know, I am optimist by nature, but you know, yesterday when we had the interaction with the Honorable Prime Minister, there was two overarching sentiments which I would like to share with your audience, with the people watching ET now. Is first was a sense of gratitude, yeah, of how the country has navigated the crisis and how is navigating the crisis.
Continuing to navigate.
Yeah, the crisis not yet over. And the second one was a renewed sense of optimism. And that's so important. At the end of the day, before you win in the marketplace, you win the battle of mind, right?
So I want to interject then. I'm sorry if I'm going to sound like a pessimist over here.
Don't
but
worry,
my job
that's your
is
job.
to be a devil's advocate. So when you say hope, optimism, are we to take it that India Inc., and you know, post your meeting with the Prime Minister, there is a plan of action when it comes to inflation, because it does seem to be structural, not transient.
No, I'll give you my perspective. Yeah, is the inflation first is it's not just Indian. Yeah,
it's
across
global,
the
and
world.
it seems to be structural.
Yeah? No, if you look at it, it's not been demand driven. Yeah, the economy had shrunk last year, the global economy. So it can't be massive demand which has resulted in this kind of. In many ways, I believe it has been driven by supply side constraints, and to some extent also it is speculative. Yeah, and if the supply side constraints get unlocked, debottlenecked, by mid of next year we should see some tapering of inflation, and that would augur well for the country. I don't think at this stage one can conclude with a high degree of probability that it is a systemic inflation which is taking place. I don't think there is evidence to corroborate that view. So if that inflation starts tapering down, and you know, all of us know that that inflation hurts the poor more than the rich.
Yeah.
And we are a country where the average is $2,000 per capita GDP, so it is highly, you know, the poor people have a very small part of the total wealth or consumption or income. It is in their interest that the inflation gets reined in.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Because a lot of the recovery we've seen has also been, and you know, I know it's a phrase that many people don't like, but I'm just doing it because everyone understands it, because of the recovery and the demand we saw in Bharat. The rural-led growth that we saw beginning last year.
But let me explain the rural-led growth, because it's important to understand what led to rural-led growth also. You will agree that rural had slowed down in 2019. Yeah, towards the end of 2019, as the calendar year was coming to a close, we were seeing the rural growth really come down. And over the last 2 years, during the pandemic period, or the 7 quarters, the rural growth has been pretty resilient. Last few months, we have seen the growth taper a bit when you look at data like Nielsen. And but if you were to look at 2-year period, it's still very robust. So there would be the base effect of last year where the growth of rural was very robust when you look at this quarter. So it's still too early to see whether there is a structural slowdown happening in rural India. But then you need to ask yourself what made it resilient. And first is the impact of the pandemic was not as severe on the mobility aspect in rural India as compared to urban India. The second was the government interventions. Just imagine the country has provided food grains, free food grains, to crores of families.
Correct.
Over a long period of time. The second was direct transfer of money. Then also our harvests were good. The MSPs went up. And during times of crisis, one of the major obligations on the nation and for the people of the country is look after the less fortunate one. So I think we have done an amazing job. So I believe, because the pandemic is not yet over, the government should continue by supporting the rural masses.
So more stimulus?
No, you know the work that they've been doing on Manrega, allocation of outlays, whether it's food supply, those are the things we need to continue doing it in rural India.
But Mr. Mehta, can we afford to keep doing it again? I'm telling you, I'm playing devil's advocate.
No, you're right, but you know...
Because we won't meet this investment target.
No,
and then
I'll come to that. I'll come to that. Life is about choices. You have to make choices. That's what determines what would be the future course of action for you. So we have to look after them. And I think if we do that, then with another good harvest, we should start seeing the momentum come back. And then a lot of people who had gone back to rural India would hopefully, if once the urban contact service sector starts moving up, they would also start moving back and they would have additional income to support their families, and that's how the virtuous spiral will start.
Correct.
So we don't need to be very dismayed about that. Yes, inflation is an issue. Inflation in the short term will impact volume growth, not necessarily the headline growth. And but if in another 2 quarters, inflation starts tapering, then I think it will augur so good for the country.
Then can I ask you, this is obviously then not the time for India to consider a rate hike, going by what you're saying, because it's a supply-led.
No, you have to understand that rate hike will not be determined in isolation. It would also depend on what the other foreign central banks do in the world, what the Fed does, for instance. You don't want a flight of capital. You want the capital to still come into the country. The other is, India will have to do a fine balance. We have a growth aspirations, and very importantly, we have to keep the inflation under check. And I think if we look at the last few years, RBI has been doing a phenomenal job. And all this is during the period of pandemic, they had a very accommodative policy. So they would have to tune that policy, but it will still have to ensure that the growth keeps happening in the economy.
Because this time Governor Das has to balance inflation, he has to also balance a strengthening US dollar.
Yeah, but he's a very capable person. And look at it, unlike in the past, you have an arsenal of $600 billion reserves. That's not a small amount.
I think time and again the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister have been saying it's time to unleash the animal spirits. We've seen the animal spirits being unleashed in the startup universe. Have they been unleashed by India Inc., the captains of India Inc.?
See, first I'll tell you is the risk appetite of Indian businessmen hasn't gone down. It's very much intact. They had to solve the balance sheet problems, which they have done. And I think there's no business person worth their salt who would like to miss any sales. So if there is demand, they would invest in it. There's no question about that. But if you're working with 60-70% capacity utilization, you wouldn't like to invest more in capital till you are clear that your utilization has gone up.
Correct.
And that will happen. I'm sure about that.
the quarter that went by, and I'm not going to get into company specifics, I'm not doing that, but there was an overarching theme where we saw margins being squeezed, the pressures had come in, and then the markets and everybody was saying, is price hike inevitable? I think India Inc. has held on for as long as they can, but do you think that is going to change in the fourth quarter of this financial year?
There will be some price hike, because what all corporations try to do is first try to tighten the belt, drive savings harder, optimize all the lines of P&L, and then depending on the industry and your capacity to take price increase, which is also dependent on, in our industry, on your brand power. If your brands are not strong, you can't take a price increase. If your brands are strong, you know that the consumers will still stick to you. So depending on that, some price would be taken, because the input cost increase is unprecedented. It's not a normal era. So there will be. And that is the reason when you see some tapering of volumes, the volume growth doesn't happen, but the headline growth is all right, don't panic. Because the consumer will titrate. And once the inflation goes down and the prices get corrected, they'll come back with volume growth.
Does India Inc. acknowledge that this is a stronger India than maybe back from the great financial crisis, when, any taper tantrum had all of us so worried and scared?
I think so. And, you were initially also talking about rupee depreciating. And, we have to look at the real effective exchange rate, right? If our inflation is higher than the dollar-denominated countries, then rupee has to adjust to remain competitive. Our exports remain competitive. So, and we should not try to attribute the strength of a country to the value of a rupee. That's misplaced, I think. It has to reflect the real value, and which will ensure that neither imports are very easy and exports do not suffer unnecessarily. So we have to look at the intrinsic strength of the economy, and there we have to look at it from a lens of GDP growth. We have to look at it from a Gini coefficient, the inclusive growth factor, and whether the individual components of GDP are moving in the right direction. The savings, the investments, and that would indicate how strong a country is. And I firmly believe that all of us aspire that a country grows at 8+% for an extended period of time, 10, 15 years. And 5 trillion, we would cross the 10 trillion mark. And that is when, as a country, we would become a middle-income country, and that could happen in our lifetime. What a wonderful thing.
Oh yeah, it's a boom time, isn't it? Mr. Mehta, you talked about that meeting with the Prime Minister. I don't expect you to break privilege and all of that. But one of the reasons the last union budget was also hailed was because in time of such uncertainty, it was a stable status quo budget. Do you think it's the time for that again, at least when it comes to taxation?
Last year was a very tough year for the country. When Madam Finance Minister must have been working on budget,
the unenviable task.
She must have been getting sleepless nights, but she did a phenomenal job, and it was unanimously acclaimed as one of the best budgets we have seen. And now her task is to build on that budget. And one of the things that we as a business, we always crave for is certainty. Certainty of tax policy and continuity of policies. And I see no reason why that will not happen.
Because this is not the time to raise taxes, I would imagine.
I don't think, if they didn't do it last year, why will they do it this year when the tax collections have gone up?
Yeah.
And government is absolutely conscious of the fact that we need to spur growth in the country.
So is that India Inc.'s main budget wish list? Keep continuity, status quo?
Because
there's also government that announces things outside of budget.
Oh, absolutely. One is the days when all of us used to look with bated breath to budget. Those are gone. Because changes, reforms keep happening throughout the year, and you don't need to wait just for the budget to unveil everything. Second is with certainty of taxes. Even that has gone away now. And I think what we be looking at is what would be government's estimate of revenues, what would be the government's allocation of resources.
Disinvestment?
And I think disinvestment, I believe that once Air India is complete, it will be a catalyst for more disinvestments to happen.
Correct.
And it will be fabulous for the country.
That's the
Air India going
expectation.
through. Yeah, and it's all lined up now. So it should happen. And if it's a smooth divestment, which I believe it will, and then we could have more disinvestments in the offing. And that would be good. And then the government should rightfully keep spending on infrastructure, which is so much required, which also has a multiplier effect. And I would also say that keep your eyes firmly on the demand and see what you could do to alleviate the hardship of the poor people.
So Mehta, I'm going to touch on 2 points that you talked about very quickly. One of them is supply constraints. Is that behind us?
See, supply constraints, again, different things have impacted different countries.
Right, from like, container shortage to the semiconductor, because you talk to everybody.
Yeah, or in the US,
Yeah.
the labor shortage. And why the labor shortage is there? Because so much of stimulus money has been given.
Yeah.
So people have got the money,
There's
they
an
don't want to
interesting
work.
article that people are leaving their jobs to start crypto startups.
Yeah, so there are different factors. But I think this has happened during this period. As governments also rein in their stimulus package, there would be a move towards a normalcy. Yeah, and of course, all businesses would be looking at debottlenecking and ensuring that the supply chain keeps running. So there would be, I'm absolutely certain, there would be an element of certainly a correction happening on the supply side.
The other point that you touched upon was on sustainability and green. We have seen what has happened this year, whether it is with ESG, the high opportunity cost. How can India seize the moment?
Yes, that's such a good question. India, we have growth aspirations, high aspirations, but at the same time, as a country or as a world or as a planet, we cannot afford the per capita greenhouse gas of the Western world. So we will have to do it in tandem. We will have to grow, but we will also have to reduce our environment footprints. That's a challenge, but
So
that's
going
also
beyond Paris.
But that's also massive opportunity. Our Prime Minister Modi has made certain commitments in Glasgow, and if you look at Paris, India is one of the few countries which is on track to deliver on its commitment. Yeah, but a lot more is to be done, and that's where R&D and innovations again come in. Yeah, green tech is extremely important for the country, and again we have to bring together all the R&D, the academia and the private corporations to work on green tech, whether it's carbon capture, whether it is carbon rainbow, whether it is carbon storage, whether it is hydrogen, and that is how we'll be able to make a difference.
I know you have a flight to catch, so I promise this will be my final question. Is it time to go back to the office, or do you think it's time once again to be in wait and watch mode?
If I give you what we are doing at HUL, and most of our people are vaccinated by now, and we have created.
But there's no boosters yet.
No, we have reconfigured the office space in a manner that the cubic space given to each individual has gone up significantly. So they're much safer. And we are not forcing anyone. And intact teams are coming in. And a lot of people are coming in on their own. And because people realize that there is a huge benefit of coming to the workplace as well.
I came here to point to come here.
Oh,
to do
thank
it,
you so
to
much.
do it in person.
Thank you so much. You're wonderful. And so, I think the days of coming to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, 52 weeks in a year, less your holidays or whatever, that's gone. The hybrid is there to stay, but each company will have to find their own balance. It would depend on the nature of industry, it would depend on the culture of the organization. We had, remote working even before the pandemic. But what pandemic has done is allowed us to do it at scale. And one thing we should be very clear, don't write the obituary of working from office. Office will remain because there are huge benefits out of it, but at the same time, don't think the world will go back to the world before the pandemic. That won't happen.
But will you pay employees the same irrespective? I don't mean HUL, but I think when I say CEOs, because that has been one concern. If somebody takes a remote location, should they be paid
You know,
as well
again,
as the one coming to office?
excuse me. No, you have to look at it from the lens of what a work a person does. If the work requires you to come to work, then the companies would be cajoling them to come to work. But if every day your work does not entail you to come to your workplace, then you could be. So it is going to be industry, company, individual or role specific. That's how it will evolve. There is not going to be one blue book which you will be able to replicate. You would, each company will have to find their own balance of how they want the hybrid to work. It's a fast evolving space.
So as we find that hybrid model and enter the new year, on a lighter note, Mr. Mehta, are you tracking developments in the crypto world, NFT, DeFi, DAO? How do CEOs like you react when you see this explosion that we saw in the year gone by?
I know, but I'm glad that our government and our Reserve Bank is catching the bull by the horn and will come to a point of view. Yeah, is because you have to look at the interest of the general people and not just look at the interest of a few.
Does that mean you're not in favor of
No,
cryptos, you don't believe in cryptos?
First is, I do not know enough about crypto to come to a point of view. I would therefore rely on my central bank and my government to come to a point of view which will be in the interest of the nation.
And with that, Mr. Mehta, I know you have a flight to catch, and I hope you'll give me more time the next time you're here in New Delhi.
We'll do that.
Thank you and happy New Year.
Thank you, and wish all of you and your audience, viewers, a very happy 2022. Remain safe and look after yourselves.
Thank you.